The topic for today's class is growth of communalism and partition of India. You can see that this is the last topic of our module 4. We are left with the discussion of the left movements in India, which will be covered in the next class. But let's focus on the growth of communalism and the partition of India. This class will basically talk about the making of Pakistan, and this is a class which is in continuation with the previous two classes. In the last classes we have been discussing about the events that occurred in Indian national movement from 1937 to 1947. This is a time period when a lot of important events took place. For example, the outbreak of the Second World War and its effect in the forms of the negotiations that landed in the Indian soil in the form of August Hoffer, Cripps Mission, B.A.L.B.'s plan and cabinet mission. We have discussed all these plans. Apart from that, this time period is very important for the growth of the Muslim League and how the demand um, resulted into a formation of a new nation by the name of Pakistan. So this class is particularly dealing with the making of Pakistan or the partitioning of India. Under this topic we will be covering 5 things. First, we look into the what ideology of communalism, what does it mean and what is it. Then we'll talk about the background of communalism in India and the rise and growth of communalism in India that took place during the colonial time period. Then we are going to look into the different components of communalism in India, then the famous two nation theory, and lastly the Indian Independence Act 1947, which formalized the partitioning of India into the two new dominions, India and Pakistan. So while starting and moving with this topic, if you have any doubts regarding the previous classes, please contact, because these classes are in continuation manner. Again, and while discussing with the making of the partition, I will be referring to my previous classes. So if you have doubt, please clarify them. Communalism in a broad sense means a strong attachment to one's own community. In popular discourse in India, it is understood as unhealthy attachment to one's own religion. It is an ideology that suppresses distinctions within the community and emphasizes the essential unity of the community against other communities. It, this way, it promotes belief in orthodox tenets and principles, intolerance and hatred of other religions, and thus divides the society. In a layman term, communalism is a particular kind of politicization of religious identity, an ideology that seeks to promote conflict between religious communities. It is a concept popularly known as religious nationalism, where a religious community is seen as a nation. Communalism refers to the conflicting interest of followers of different religions or of different religious communities that are seen to be mutually incompatible, antagonist, and hostile. Communalism as an ideology has both positive as well as negative aspects. In the positive aspects of communalism stands for the affinity of an individual towards his own community, involving efforts for the social and economic upliftment of the community. People are more attached to their religious community and they are working for their upliftment. Whereas it has a negative connotation as well, where the ideology emphasizes the separate identity of a religious group in relation to the other groups, with a tendency to promote its own interests at the expenses of the other, where one community tries to show that it is more superior and better than the other religious community. India being a diverse nation, a lot of religion lives in India. In ancient Indian society, people of different faith coexisted but peacefully. Buddha was perhaps the first Indian prophet who gave the concept of secularism. Meanwhile, kings like Ashoka followed a policy of peace and religious tolerance. During the medieval India, we have witnessed the arrival of Islam in India, marked by occasional occurrence of violence, such as Mahmud Ghazni's destruction of Hindu temples and Mahmud of Ghaur's attack on Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist. We have studied about them in the last semester. While religion was an important part of people's life, but there was no communal ideology or communal politics that was happening or practiced during the medieval India. Rulers like Akbar and Shah Suri followed the religious policy of toleration towards different cultures and traditions across country. However, some sectarian rulers like Aurangzeb were among the least tolerant towards other religious practices. As a modern phenomena, it has arose as a result of British colonial impact and the response of Indian social strata. It has been used by the Britishers as a political propaganda tool to create divide, differences, and tensions between the communities on the basis of religious and ethnic identity, leading to communal hatred and violence. But to look upon the communal problem in India simply as the Hindu Muslim question based on religious antagonism between them is misleading. The communal problem at its base was more politically motivated than religious oriented. Apart from the Hindus and the Muslims, the British acted as a third party in the communal triangle. As you can see in the triangle, that not only the Hindus and the Muslims were fighting, but the Britishers were acting like a catalyst in this fight. The Britishers interposed themselves between the Hindus and the Muslims and thus created a communal triangle of which they remained the base. They were neither the true friends of the Muslims nor the foes of Hindus. They were the true friends of British rule in India and their imperial interest. They acted on the tried and tested maxim of divide and rule policy in India. Looking at the background of communalism in India, there was hardly any communal ideology or communal politics before the 1870s, and the best example is the revolt of 1857, where Hindus and Muslims fought together against the Britishers. Communalism had its root in the modern colonial socio-economic political structure. The post-revolt anti-Muslim attitude of the Britishers changed in the 1870s with the rise of the Indian nationalism. They now followed more actively the policy of divide and rule and championed the cause of Muslims. They realized that during the revolt of 1857 that if the Muslims and Hindus will fight together against the Britishers, then it will become difficult for the Britishers to rule over India. And that is why they started practicing the divide and rule policy, which was visible mostly during the partitioning of Bengal in the year 1905. Apart from this, communalism emerged as a result of the emergence of new mass-based modern politics, which necessitated wider links and loyalties among the people and formation of new identities based on the birth and spread of modern ideas of nations, class, and cultural linguistic identities. Religious consciousness got transformed into communal consciousness in some part of the country and among some section of the people. Nationalism failed to spread equally rapidly among the Muslim lower middle class as it did among the Hindus and Parsis. The colonial government treated Hindus, Muslims, and Sikh as a separate communities and readily accepted communal leaders as their authentic representatives. It showed extraordinary tolerance to the propagation of virulent communal hatred through press, which is quite visible when the Britishers tried to provide the separate electorates to the Muslims in 1909 and later on to the Sikh in the 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Apart from all these things, during the 1880s, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan played a very important role in the rise of communal separatism when he declared that the political interests of Hindus and Muslims were not the same but different and even divergent. He also preached complete obedience to British rule and even opposed the newly born Indian National Congress by organizing a movement of loyalty with Raja Shiv Prasad of Banaras. He also began to preach that since the Hindus formed the majority, they would dominate the Muslims in case of the weakening or withdrawal of the British rule. From here onwards, it is visible that the Britishers were became an ally in the eyes of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was preferring the Britishers over the Indians or over the Hindus or the congressmen at that period of time. Let us look into the factors which were helpful in the growth of communal and separatist mentality among the Muslims. The first important reason was the relative backwardness of the Muslims. Initially, the upper class Muslims were anti-British, which meant that they were conservative and hostile to the modern education. Thus, the modern Western education failed to spread among the Muslims, which further on resulted into the less number of educated Muslims when compared to the Hindus, Parsis, or Christians. Similarly, the Muslims had also taken little part in the growth of trade and industry and were commercially and economically backward. Therefore, big landlords with vested interest in the British rule retained their influence over the Muslim masses. Moreover, since modern education was essential for entry into government services, there were few Muslims with government jobs. They lagged behind in this respect as well. The government had also consciously discriminated against the Muslims after 1858. With passage of time, modern education spread among the Muslims. Educated Muslims looked for government employment. However, the opportunities were few. Thus, it was easy for the British officials and loyalist Muslim leaders to incite the educated Muslims against the educated Hindus. Another factor was the communal side effects of socio-religious reform movements. The socio-religious reform movements and the revival movements, both for the Hindus and Muslims of the 19th century, contained some mutually contradictory aspects. For example, the Wahhabis movement was against all non-Muslims and aimed to establish the world of Islam. Similarly, the Dayanand Saraswati's slogan of Aryanization of India aims at the Shuddhi or the conversion of non-Hindus to Hinduism was unpalatable to the Muslims. Another important factor was the Hindu tinge in the political work and the ideas of the militant nationalist. The speeches and writings of some of the militant nationalists emphasized ancient Indian culture to the exclusion of medieval Indian culture. They identified Indian culture and the Indian nation with the Hindu religion and Hindus and thus abandoned the element of composite culture. They referred to Maharana Pratap, Shivaji, and Guru Gobind Singh as national heroes and the Muslim rulers like Akbar, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb as foreigners. Although leaders like Tilak and Gandhi were strong believers in Hindu Muslim unity, but in their writings and speeches they often employed a language, imagery, and symbolism derived exclusively from Hindu sources. For example, the slogan of Ramrajya popularized by Gandhi. It did create a reaction in the Muslim mind. British and pro-British propagandists took advantage of this to poison the minds of the Muslims. The Hindu tinge also created ideological openings for Hindu communities and made it difficult for the nationalist movement to eliminate Hindu communal political and ideological element within its own rank. It also helped the spread of a Muslim tinge among Muslim nationalists. Some scholars see partition as a culmination of a communal politics that started developing in the opening decades of the 20th century. Let us look into the landmarks in the growth of communalism. The first important landmark is the formation of the Muslim League in the year 1906. The League supported the Bengal partition of 1905, demanded special safeguards for Muslims in government service, and put forward, with the help of Lord Minto, the demand for separate electorate, and it got accepted in the Morley Minto reform in year 1909. It preached that the interests of the Muslims were different from those of the Hindus and opposed every nationalist and democratic demands of the Congress. The British used the League to counterpose the rising nationalism. The British also encouraged the League to approach the Muslim masses and assume their leadership. The year from 1909 to 1919 was quite important for the developments between the Hindus and Muslims. During this period of time, the first important event that took place was the First World War. The after effect of the First World War was the Khilafat movement that we have studied during the launching of the non-cooperation movement. We have seen that in the Lucknow Pact in 1916 brought Hindus and Muslims together, where the Indian National Congress and the Muslim Leagues were working together against the Britishers. Apart from that, the Khilafat movement was launched, where the Hindus and Muslims together worked for the launching of the non-cooperation movement, the first mass movement launched by Mahatma Gandhi. In the year 1919, the Government of India Act was passed, which extended the communal electorates to include the Sikh. The frustration resulting from the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement was taken advantage by communal elements, and this resulted in numerous communal riots. The appointment of the Simon Commission and the Round Table conferences that followed brought the Muslim League into activity. The communal award of the British government in 1932 further widened the gulf between the Hindus and the Muslims. The provincial elections of February 1937, organized on the basis of restricted franchise and separate electorates, further produced separatist sentiments. The electoral results of the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha were abjectly poor. The landlord and money lender parties also fared badly. They began to shift their support to the communal parties. It was now that the communalism entered the fascist phase and communal parties began to gather strength. Jinnah, now bitterly opposed to Congress, spread the cry that the Muslim minority was in danger of being engulfed by Hindu majority, propagated the famous two-nation theory, and ultimately demanded the partition and creation of Pakistan in the Lahore session of the League in 1940. In the August offer, the Viceroy refused to accede to the wartime national demand, saying that power could not be transferred to a body whose authority was denied by a large and powerful minority, that is, the Muslim League. The Cripps mission proposed the exercise of the discretion by the provinces to negotiate independently, and this was highly objectionable to the Congress. The League, however, rejected the offer as now it was demanding a definite declaration in favor of the creation of a separate Muslim state and seats on a 50-50 basis with the Congress. Jinnah's stubbornness in sticking to the League's right to nominate all the Muslim members of the new Executive Council, together with B.A.L.B's unwillingness to sign any agreement with the Congress, alone led to the breakdown of the negotiations at the Simla Conference. The Viceroy's action implied not only that of an official recognition of the League monopoly to speak for all Muslims and thereby inflating its stature in the Muslim eyes, but also of conceding to the League in substance the power to negate any future negotiations that did not suit its own convenience. Thus, the policy of divide and rule was at its zenith. Now let's look into the different components of communalism in India which were responsible for partition. While looking at this triangle, you can see that there were three important parties which are responsible for the partition. Let's first look into the Hindu. Part of the blame of the culmination of Muslim separatism in the demand for Pakistan must also go to certain Hindu organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha. In its early stages, nationalists like Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya and Lala Lajpat Rai led the Mahasabha, and its main object was to supplement and strengthen the Congress. But conservative and reactionary elements gradually assumed a dominant position in the Mahasabha, and by 1937, under the leadership of V.D. Savarkar, it propagated the doctrine of Hindu Rashtra. Hindu communal nationalism was a reaction to Muslim separatism and the bureaucratic patronage enjoyed by the latter. An equal role was also played by the Britishers. The British masters, who preferred to use the policy of divide and rule as per their need and convenience, sowed the seed of communalism in India. Many communal parties like the Muslim League had patronage of the government for a considerable period of time. The British used the League to counterpose the rising nationalism and keeping the emerging Muslim intelligentsia from joining the nationalist movement. The British also encouraged the League to approach the Muslim masses and assume their leadership. The idea of Pakistan was not new to the bureaucracy. After 1914, when the Muslim League had declared Pakistan as its goal, it received direct and indirect encouragement from the British government. In their public utterances, officials had harped on the differences which divided Hindu and Muslim. British visualized a divided India, although they continued to render lip service to the idea of unity. And the most important role was played by Muslim League. The Muslim League, from its very inception, was a communal body established to look after the political rights and interests of the Muslim community alone. The Muslim demand for Pakistan was based on the famous two nation theory. The poet and political thinker Muhammad Iqbal is thought to be the originator of the idea of the separate Muslim state for the Indian Muslims and is believed to have given the necessary emotional content to the movement. Rahmat Ali visualized the Punjab, northwest frontier province, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan as the national home of the Indian Muslims, and he coined the word Pakistan in 1933. The word Pakistan was formed by taking the initials of the first four and the last of the fifth. Rahmat Ali maintained that the Hindus and Muslims were fundamentally distinct nations. The most unequivocal declaration of the Hindus and Muslims as separate nationalities was made by Jinnah at the Lahore session of the League in March 1940. Demanding the partition of India, the Muslim League passed the resolution in this regard. Lahore session of the Muslim League gave it the ambition and a program. The two nation theory developed between 1937 and 1940. It was based on the fact that Hindu and Muslim follow different and distinct social orders. They belong to two different religions with distinct philosophies, social customs, literature, and so on. They neither intermarry nor interdine together, and indeed they belong to two different civilizations. Their aspects and life are different. It is quite clear that Hindus and Muslims derive their inspiration from different sources of history. They have different heroes, different episodes. Very often, the hero of one is the foe of the other, and likewise, their victories and defeats overlap. To yoke together two such nations under a single state, one as a numerical minority and one as a numerical majority, must lead to growing discontent and final destruction of any fabric that may be built up for the government of such a state. This famous two nation theory formed the base for this demand of a separate nations for the Muslim, which resulted into the making of Pakistan. The formal transfer of power into Indian hands was affected by the Indian Independence Act passed by the British Parliament in July 1947. Let us look into the main provisions of this act. I'll be sending out reading material related to the Indian Independence Act 1947. You can read the whole act, but for a time being, let's discuss the important provisions of this act. The first important provision stated that British rule will end in India on 15th August 1947, and it also provided for the establishment of two dominions of India and Pakistan. The two dominions were given the right to secede from the British Commonwealth. The Act abolished the office of Secretary of State for India and transferred his functions to the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs. It provided for the appointment of the Governor General in each of the dominions. The Governor General was to be appointed by the British King on advice of the Cabinet of the concerned dominion. The Governor General and governors of the provinces were expected to act on the advice of the ministries in all matters, including those matters where they could exercise their special and discretionary power. Thus, they were reduced to the position of constitutional heads, which is important to look for the references in the today's constitution as well. The act deprived the monarch of the right to veto law or to ask for reservation of certain laws for his approval. The crown was also to drop the title of Emperor of India. The British government was to transfer all the powers to the constituent assemblies of the two dominions. Pending the formation of new constitution for each dominion, the constituent assemblies of the two dominions was to act as legislatures. These legislatures were given legislative sovereignty as in other dominion legislatures under the Statute of Westminster. This meant that no law made by the legislature could be held void or inoperable even if it came into effect with the laws of the British Parliament. No act of the British Parliament could be extended to any dominion unless it was adopted by the legislature of the respective country as part of its law. Till a new constitution was framed by each dominion, all the provinces were to be administered in accordance with the provisions of the Government of India Act 1935. However, the dominions were given the power to make necessary modification in 1935 Act. With this, we mark the end of this class. If you have any doubts regarding the classes, you can contact me on my email ID asmita.chataria1994 at the rate gmail.com.